Welcome, everybody. Today's webinar is Challenges and Successes with Shared Use Mobility in Rural, Frontier, and Tribal Areas. It's a virtual workshop co-hosted by National RTAP and the Shared Use Mobility Center, SUMC, and we will be hearing from experts at Texas A&M Transportation Institute. Thank you for joining us today. For this webinar, you can ask questions or share comments throughout the webinar in the chat. During the presentation portion, please stay muted. During the breakout session and question and answer portion, you can raise your hand, especially in the breakout session. We will want to hear from you. And in the Q&A, you'll be asked to unmute yourself to ask a question or share a comment. The slides and a recording of this presentation will be posted on the National RTAP webinars page within a week of today. We will not post the breakout room parts. You will receive a brief survey tomorrow to help us improve future webinars and workshops, and we hope that you fill it out to give us your feedback. You're probably very familiar with Zoom. You can turn your video on or off or as you wish, mute or unmute. We ask you to remain mute during the presentation part of this. Here's the chat box. If you have questions, you can raise your hand and do reactions. A little bit about National RTAP. We're a technical assistance center funded by FTA through its Section 5311 Rural program. We provide free training materials and technical assistance to rural and tribal transit providers and to state RTAPs. We're governed by a review board, which is composed of 14 state DOT and rural and tribal agency staff from across the country. Our website is nationalrtap.org. We also administer the TACL website. TACL is the Transportation Technical Assistance Coordination Library. And it's a library all about transportation coordination from FTA and its Technical Assistance Center, which does include SUMC. Now I'm going to introduce our SUMC presenters. Al Benedict is the Director for Learning Center and Accessibility Programs at SUMC, where he is responsible for managing several national projects to evaluate opportunities and economic and environmental benefits related to shared mobility and integrated transportation systems. SUMC Program Coordinator, Nate Seeskin, has a strong background and passion for transportation, public policy, and social justice. So they will talk to you about SUMC. Thank you, Alan, Nate.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kara, for having us participate in today's program. SUMC is a nonprofit that seeks to bolster shared mobility and public transportation through knowledge sharing and technical assistance related work. So through that, one of our big programs is the Mobility Learning Center, which you can see on the screen here. This is a go-to resource in the industry where people can learn more about best practices and current events in the shared mobility industry and learn about topics such as microtransit and rural shared mobility. So I think a lot of what we'll be discussing in today's workshop can also be supplemented by you can supplement a lot of what you learned today through going to the Mobility Learning Center. Al, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, just thank you, Kara, Todd, and Michael for inviting us. We're going to turn our cameras off, and then kind of in the breakout, we'll lead. Nate and I will be leading different breakout rooms along with Todd and Michael. So, thank you, and we look forward to the presentation as well.
And you'll have a chance, if you'd like to learn more about SUMC after the presentation parts. Again, this is a workshop on challenges and successes with shared use mobility. and our panelists from the Texas Transportation Institute today that we are delighted to have with us are Todd Hansen and Michael Walk. Todd Hansen is an associate research scientist with the Transit Mobility Program at TTI, located in their Houston, Texas office. His research focuses on best practices for public transportation agencies, innovative practices in on-demand transportation, accessibility to fixed route and on-demand transit for persons with disabilities, and analysis of transit agency operational and financial data. He has led technical assistance projects researching practices in shared mobility planning, service scenarios for on-demand responsive public transportation, and performance measurement for multimodal transportation systems. He is one of the co-chairs for the Standing Committee on Accessible Transportation and Mobility at TRB. Michael J. Walk is a research scientist and the program manager in the Transit Mobility Program at TTI. Michael has 14 years of management and executive experience in public transit, conducting research, leading projects, and training. Michael specializes in transit planning, operations and scheduling, collaborative problem solving, process improvement, transit performance management and measurement, transit funding and financial management, transit regulatory compliance, data collection and analysis, customer and community outreach, and applying innovative and technology to transportation challenges. A warm welcome to Todd and Michael. And I'm just going to admit people, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And
all right. Let me see, can you all see my screen now with the same slide?
Looks good to me.
Looks
Todd.
like it. All right. Thank you very much, Kara, and thank you from TTI to National RTAP and SUMC for hosting us for this webinar. We are very fortunate to be able to connect with them on this workshop and to see so many folks today in the participants listing that are interested in this subject. And you know, obviously, as on-demand and transportation, you know, has become, you know, a bigger and bigger topic that you know, agencies are looking at, and you know, maybe agencies that haven't have a little bit of experience with it or have worked with it before are you know, trying to figure out what works best for them, or overcome challenges that they've experienced in their service area, particularly for service areas and agencies that are more rural in nature. You know, this is becoming you know, something that these service solutions can offer a lot of promise, but you know, have you know, a lot to be proven to you know, really be able to provide what's best for you know, rural communities that are specific to the community and specific to meeting the travel needs of riders. So that's what we're going to be talking about today as part of this session. We're going to start with some background about you know, the project that we're doing. This is part of a NCHRP, National Highway Cooperative Research Program project that we're doing this activity. You may have attended one of our workshops similar to this in person or virtual earlier this year. But what we're doing with this is, if you haven't attended before, is trying to have a session that's focused on you know, discussion and input on the needs of transportation in rural, tribal, and frontier areas, along with, you know, any ideas or examples that you as a participant will get later on to you know, our breakout sessions and such, on ideas for solutions to those service challenges. So the goal of this is to gather input from transportation providing organizations or stakeholders or other researchers and such as yourselves as attendees to get a further understanding of how to implement viable and scalable shared mobility services in these areas. So these outcomes are going to be incorporated as part of this project that we're doing. So we're going to start with in this presentation portion on to talk about some of the background with the project and goals, which I'll get to in a second in the following slides. So that's going to be for roughly the next half hour. And then after that, we're going to get into small group breakouts that we'll do virtually here over Zoom that myself and Michael from TTI and then Al and Nate from SUMC will be leading on respective topics to have some more in-depth discussion. We'll then reconvene together to discuss what were some of the main points that were learned in those breakout rooms. And hopefully that's with this session, while we're learning from attendees, we're able to learn from each other with this and talk about some of the challenges and solutions in this area that we're all passionate about here. So in terms of the goals for this project, what we're building towards is looking at how a variety of stakeholders and transportation providers from state DOTs to public transportation agencies, specialized transportation agencies, volunteer driver programs and other health and human service agencies, as well that provide service in rural areas, local government agencies and stakeholder partners can help have the tools and information necessary to better facilitate the implementation of the shared mobility solutions that they want or desire to help overcome the challenges of service in less populated areas. What we're building towards with this project, of course, there'll be a final report that comes out of this, but we're also going to have a implementation guidebook that is the resulting product from this. And this will be a key resource with some tools on implementation activities for suggestion, as well as tools about the in coordination and agreement with other public and private partners, how that can be best done. And so these products will hopefully be great resources that we're using and building from the outreach activities such as sessions like this today, as well as in-depth case studies that we're doing on rural agencies around the US. So that's what's going to be coming out of this. And in terms of your role, not only is your participation today valuable for helping to provide input and comment and discussion on what is important to consider in these topics and what in your experience in working with other service providers or working in coordination of rural service, implementing a technology solution for better service to customers. This will help not only learn from each other as part of the discussion today, but help guide really the contents that is needed for other agencies and your peers to be able to help with. So that's the goal of this. We're also and I'll reiterate this later on during the wrap up, but for anyone that's interested in being continually apprised of the project progress as we get further down the road, and if you'd like to help be a external review or resource as we get further along with the development of this stuff, you'll have that opportunity as well, and you can provide us with your contact to reach out to again. So in terms of the background for what we're including in our purview for this discussion, it's important to first define a few terms for what we mean when we're talking about shared mobility, because I think, and many of you, know this, of course, in terms of these definitions, but still to think about, what do we mean that we're including as part of the scope is some good table setting to do for this activity. So when we talk about shared use mobility, what we're, defining this as is really any transportation services, including, but also beyond public transit, that are designed to provide users with mobility on a vehicle or other conveyance that service on an as needed basis. So without having to own their own vehicle. And for the image we have on the screen, for those of you that aren't able to see it, we have a few examples of different types of modes that are under this umbrella term for shared use mobility. Obviously, we have bus service, fixed route, and demand response that goes under that, but also carpooling and van pooling services and volunteer driver programs. We have for hire services from taxi companies, TNCs, or transportation network companies, and other for hire services. We have micro mobility with bike share and scooter share modes that fall under that. As well as, as mentioned earlier, micro transit or on-demand demand responsive service, that is proliferated, the last few years, especially with that. So those are the types of things that this is concerned with, and thinking about how we look at that in different service contexts. Beyond that, of course, on demand is as opposed to advanced reservation, the ability to reserve or dispatch a service upon request. So, essentially the day of, or even the moment of, depending on the service platform. And then when we think about mobility on demand, this is really looking at building a interconnected and coordinated mobility system that meets the needs of all users. And this can include personalized mobility options, and even goods delivery in some places that are matched with a coordinated network of service providers. So those are the types of service concepts that we're trying to look at as far as how that connects to a rural context, as rural agencies have tried this in various implementations over the years. When we talk about what rural and frontier areas are in the US, there are varying definitions and categories for what is considered rural in America. For example, one study on emerging technologies in rural areas found that there could be as many as 8 different rural county types, depending on the combination of housing and land uses and activities that are there. The U.S. Census Bureau defines rural as any area or territory that's not within an urban area that contains 50,000 or more people. Whereas the U.S. Office of Management and Budget assigns counties as either metropolitan, micropolitan, or neither, with listing metro areas as places with 50,000 people or more, and defining rural any micro areas that are between 10,000 and then 49,000 plus people, and counties outside of metropolitan areas. One categorization that's pretty interesting in terms of frontier areas, and this is where, if the image on the screen, for those of you that can't see it, it has a map of the continental United States, as well as Alaska and Hawaii, and has by county, counties that are indicated as frontier areas or non-frontier areas, with the frontier areas being indicated in blue, shaded blue. And this is level 1 of a frontier classification according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, showing that they actually have tiers for frontier remote regions mapped by county according to the application of travel times of 60 minutes or more between the county and a metro or micro region with various population counts for that region. So for instance, this at level 1 is the highest tier 1, being 50,000 or more people, at least 60 minutes, 60 minutes away. And then it goes down to tier 2 at 25,000 people, which is even more remote than this, and all the way down to tier 4 at 2,500 people. And so this is a system for coding what county travel time essentially is, that to a metropolitan region that makes it more remote. But of course, we know that, you know, even this map doesn't show, you know, all the rural areas and travel challenges and distance, as well as geography challenges that are presented in rural service. So when thinking about shared mobility in rural areas, even as shared mobility options such as the types of services I mentioned earlier for hire ride services, microtransit, car sharing, micromobility, even as these services have expanded their footprint in the US, most of these services are focused in the larger metropolitan areas for reasons of profitability and viability, of course. In some places, rural transportation agencies and local stakeholder organizations have worked with shared mobility companies to develop pilots or services for improving access to on-demand transportation. But issues for developing these services can include, but are not limited to, things like funding requirements and sustainability, service equivalency, driver and vehicle availability, broadband and cellular infrastructure, payment and software integration, and many more. And a lot of these topics will be included as part of our breakout discussions. And so, you know, because of these challenges, there's further improvements that are needed with this in association with the services in planning and coordinating on-demand service in these non-urban communities. So even as these operations have continued to expand into smaller cities or smaller markets, you know, there is still a general lack of availability of these services due to the lower trip demand compared to urban areas, and the lack of clusters of density to stage vehicles, whether they be for the for-hire ride services or otherwise. Some rural transportation agencies and stakeholders have organized programs to help fill these needs through traditional communication channels and collaboration, but perhaps not with the technology-enabled platforms that are available from newer companies. When we talk about user characteristics and trends in rural service, what we've found is that barriers in accessing transportation services in rural communities can, of course, include longer travel distances, lower population density, and safety and infrastructure issues. In low density and rural areas, demand for public transit service typically comes from populations that are especially reliant on transit options, such as older adults, persons with disabilities, and households with lower incomes. In recognition of typical transit service demand, there can be examples of working groups that identify needs for particular destinations for travel, such as job training, recovery centers, medical appointments, and support groups. So those are some of the examples of filling that need that we found. But one of the things typically in terms of trends for patterns of trip demand is that they can often relate to rural transit. Relate to rural transit demographics. There's often greater challenges that are posed, from the state of the differences in demographics between different areas. So, for example, with rural transit can be more vulnerable to declines in ridership due to wider geographic coverage areas and more rapidly aging populations compared to urban areas, which in turn affects available formula funding as a result of lower trip performance measures. Prior to COVID-19, rural transit ridership on the whole was actually on a recent trend of increasing. And then now since COVID-19, of course, there's been various levels of recovery and ridership, depending on the specific community and such. So that continues to be, a challenge. And, also with older adults, the over 65-year-old population is continuing to increase, and this continues to have a outsized impact or a larger proportional impact in rural areas compared to urban counterparts. And one study found that the U.S. is projected to double in the over 65 population by the time we reach 2050. So that's going to exacerbate our impacts as well. In terms of mobility needs, transit agencies for a long time have looked at flexible transportation services and different options that can be valuable for trying to address requirements and service demand in areas with lower irregular travel demand and transit demand. Also, things like informal carpooling can often occur and then be further organized to help in situations with friends and family members, helping folks travel together for work or other regular weekday activities. But most rural transit agencies, of course, have fewer resources or maybe have older software reservation systems that require customers to make trip reservations the day in advance as opposed to the day of. And then rural residents typically have to travel longer distances to access education, health services, shopping, and employment. With many of these trips being inconvenient on public transit, just due to the circumstances of service. So these are some of the things that travelers encounter themselves. There we go, advance. And then as we talked about some of the other issues facing rural transit agencies and in terms of dispersed population locations, factors like depopulation of younger age cohorts into urban areas, also driver availability, road quality, digital connectivity, and infrastructure. These challenges, of course, can compound. And so rural transit agencies are often faced with stretching limited resources and available funding in order to meet existing service demands. Sometimes with increasing road calls or maintenance due to the circumstances at hand. Meanwhile, decisions to make policy decisions for the agency can have different priorities for service availability, and particularly for looking at funding for rural transit. There can also be challenges with funding sources and local sponsorships occurring in silos that then have conflicting procurement restrictions or performance requirements or allowability for certain types of trips. Meanwhile, for-hire ride services like TNCs that operate on a national scale will often not go into rural communities on their own, and instead look for public partners to help share some of the operational risk, which then, of course, can be a challenge for the transit agency in being able to share that risk and provide funding, and also with pilot projects that have a limited amount of financial resources to help commit to those pilots, can mean that maybe the resources available for that service are exhausted, before planned for the demonstration. So those can be challenges in those sorts of sharing of risk, that tie into the limited funding resources challenge, of course. And, it means that agencies have to be wary of, contracting for a service and knowing that that doesn't necessarily ensure lower cost for service delivery. To talk a little bit about some specific, area needs within rural, one of the things we wanted to highlight was tribal transportation and tribal specific needs. These can vary, of course, based on the location of the specific tribal area and where the customer location and compared to the different county nearby metropolitan county or area for travel, if that's where the travel is occurring, especially in relation to what health, employment, and essential services are available for travel. But there can be often, an additional degree of remoteness, for folks, for tribal members that are often having to travel a long way to access services. And so in response to these needs, tribal transit services can often be expansive in covering a lot of additional land area in order to do these trips. For example, a tribal rural transit service in Montana, provides trips that are as long as 3.5 hours, from of ride time in order to get to the nearby service and need. And so, having these services, can be even more challenging with in providing a needed service for residents, of course, with available vehicles and drivers, as well as the internet access and cellular data in certain areas that are available or the lack thereof. But often, connecting to employment centers and medical activities can provide an opportunity for partnership agreements, of course. And, we found that for tribal transit services that are connecting to employment centers, that can be a great sponsor to help with revenues for further finance of operations that could be available. And that's, of course, contingent on positive relationships and building those relationships between different stakeholders. So talk a little bit about accessibility, particularly for persons with disabilities to shared use mobility service. Of course, for persons needing a wheelchair accessible vehicle, or as we have it abbreviated on the screen, a WAVE, WAV, needing a wheelchair accessible vehicle to complete a trip. In the case of a taxi company or another third-party provider, such as a TNC, sometimes those are used as subcontractors in a partnership with the transit agency to fulfill accessible trip requests. And in rural areas, there are often not as many third-party providers with wheelchair accessible vehicles available to hire for purchase transportation services. And then partnership options with TNCs often use pass this along in terms of a third party providing the wheelchair accessible vehicle. And so that can mean that subcontracting that trip to a for-hire ride service, for instance, that doesn't have their own accessible vehicles, then can present additional accessibility challenges for riders needing that accommodation. And the other thing with this is that partnership options with TNCs that are using wheelchair accessible vehicle enabled services to provide, say, a last mile connection to transit service can have had mixed results in terms of the service response time and the vehicle availability for persons requesting those vehicles. Also in subject with this recently has been commingling with within for-hire ride services or microtransit vehicles in particular. Commingling is, for those unfamiliar with the term, is when both the ADA paratransit trip or customer and another rider customer are matched and grouped together in the same demand responsive vehicle. And several microtransit services with public transit agencies recently began piloting or permanently operating a commingling service to group different passenger trip types together in the same vehicles. And so what this does is group these trips together on the technology platform, dynamically to have the greatest route efficiency or the better improved route efficiency for vehicles when trips are matched together. But there are, with commingling designs, there is some further research or knowledge needed to assess whether these designs of service are compliant in terms of meeting the equivalent response times and meeting the needs of riders with any non-mobility related disabilities as well in terms of the rules for ADA complementary paratransit. For small towns and rural areas, commingling different trip types on the same vehicles could potentially bring about increased service and cost efficiencies, for agencies looking to begin or sustain a microtransit service. And indeed, there have been examples of some rural or small urban areas that have looked at that. And then finally, to last and certainly not least in the background discussion, talk a little bit about equity of shared use mobility service. Typically for private services going into rural areas, they have partnered with local governments to make adjustments that better accommodate particularly customers with low incomes that live in more rural areas that may have reduced payment options. They may not have a credit card or bank account, may lack a smartphone themselves, or have low internet access. And so making adjustments to the service access to be able to provide an opportunity to use it. So, for example, to be able to call in and request trips, or to hail trips from a physical point, things like kiosk or call centers are often used to accommodate these requests for people who do not have access to a smartphone. And then the method of payment to access rural transit services is also something that is commonly looked at with solutions such as prepaid debit cards or gas cards or other sorts of other ways that in the cashless environment for on-demand services that have looked at having those sorts of things. So a couple examples, not on the slide, but Montpelier in Vermont has kiosk for being able to check out vehicles and uses a call center as well. Neil's, California, their car share program offers a free gas card included in the rental price and has a physical kiosk inside a commercial property adjacent to the vehicle locations to help make reservations. And then many on-demand services have also used prepaid debit cards as a solution to access microtransit or TNCs or other sorts of things. In addition, access to services for non-English speakers or non-primary English speakers is also a key consideration for rural and tribal communities to have access to the service for populations, and being able to have information in different languages that are used in the region is important for people to be able to request and use trips. Another thing, the other day I was talking with a agency with a volunteer driver program in a community with a lot of Spanish speaking population, and having the required courses for being certified to be a volunteer driver in Spanish as opposed to English was a very important barrier that needed to be addressed in their area to be able to sign up drivers for that. So, it goes beyond some of the things we typically think about in terms of these sorts of barriers. And of course, this doesn't even begin to address the challenges with the equity of implementation of where these services are available versus where they aren't, and which communities get to have access to that. So with that, I've talked a lot about kind of the background and table setting for the project. And now we are going to go into breakout groups on in a few different areas. So these are the topics that we have for our 4 rooms. And so you can choose, or if you don't choose, then you'll be, I believe, funneled into one of these rooms for a topic. But the 4 general topics that we'll have are financial and organizational resources, compliance and accessibility, geographic coverage and infrastructure, and partnerships and coordination. So within each of those, we'll have some open discussion, some question prompts, and what we're going to do is do that for about 25 or 30 minutes. Each of our TTI or SUMC group leads will guide the discussion, and then we'll come back and report back to the broader audience what we discussed within those rooms. So I think, Kara, we're ready to go to the breakouts. Thank you. We're going to go ahead. I'm going to share my screen again just for the prompts, but we wanted to make sure that everyone was able to hear from the breakout groups that you weren't a participant in, to get some general report outs from each of the leads. So I'll go ahead and start, and then I'll go to Michael, and then maybe Nate and Al in terms of order. But we had the group on accessibility and compliance, and so some of the main things that we talked about as a group in terms of challenges for persons with disabilities and older adults in particular are, of course, technology access, and being able to access and either access or have familiarity or comfort with the smartphone technology. That's often the major access point for services is very tricky. Not everyone has it, or not everyone wants to use it. Typically for the technology, even if having the smartphone is there, people are going to want to call in, and there's an importance to have a dispatch and manual enter option available for folks in rural areas. We also talked about just the challenges with that rural transit agencies can have with manual scheduling and older software systems, and being able to cover large areas and put people in with the schedule, and that having one bad experience for a customer can be a turnoff to using a system. And so it's important to have consistency of a service quality, essentially, so that trust in the system is there. We also talked about marketing in terms of marketing the service as being important through all types of media channels and local organizations and stakeholders to help get the word out about the service, particularly for folks that don't have or trust the technology as much. But we did, in terms of these types of services addressing accessibility challenges, particularly for microtransit, our group shared that often in the right size area with the right amount of vehicles available, that customers, if they have availability to reserve the trip in the way they like, that there can be a lot of comfort in having the the on-demand day of trip reservation as opposed to day in advance, to be able to provide that. So even with the service style being new, that wasn't necessarily the barrier. We talk a lot more about barriers with having vehicles and drivers, which I think other groups are going to touch upon as well. But that was, really a lot of the, technology access and comfort was some of the main takeaways that we heard. So I'll go to Michael.
Howdy. Looks like I'm unmuted, so you can hear me, right, Todd?
Yep.
Thumbs up. All right, awesome. Yeah, I'll keep it really short and sweet, given that we're pretty low on time. In the group, the finance and resources group, financial and organizational resources, we talked about funding in particular, and interestingly, yeah, the general agreement was funding can be very limited, particularly because some of these on-demand services are more costly from at least a cost per rider standpoint, and also may increase demand over traditional advanced reservation demand response. So you have sort of this catch-22, like, hey, my ridership's going up, but the funding mechanisms and schemes that were in place beforehand were more for, appropriate for advanced reservation demand response. And the silos in funding came up through a couple of conversations, a lot of special interest funding or funding specifically for this county or for this group of riders that often can be difficult to try to cobble together, a meaningful funding source to support in a sustainable way mobility in rural areas. We talked about resource challenges also, including just not a lot of guidance out there on shared use mobility in rural areas, whether it's micromobility, microtransit, and other things. Staffing shortages, of course, was an issue, not only of operators, but also other frontline personnel, and also just having the right qualifications or finding the right people to be able to use the tools that are available, how to make the most of the assets and resources that a transit provider or transportation provider has can be very difficult. There are examples out there where people are trying to work on this, of course, through the guidebooks and also through helping training that helps you try to learn how to retain your employees. I think last, sharing is a big benefit, and anytime providers can get together, talk about issues, share policies, talk about common problems. We had a few examples come up where states are actually doing that on a proactive basis, and helping people to coordinate across the state is a huge benefit. And lastly, from a cost analysis perspective, that's another place where there's not so much standardized resources out there, but definitely room. There are some agencies that have been doing cost analysis, seeing whether it's more cost effective to do service X, service Y, or service Z, but there's not a whole lot of documentation out there. It's mostly case studies. So I'll stop there and turn it to you. Whoever's next.
I think Al.
Thanks, Todd. So our breakout group was geographic coverage and infrastructure. And so we just kind of summarizing the 4 questions that we talked about. In rural areas, dialysis trips are among the most challenging, in part because the centers are unwilling to pay for trips, and they also have high expectations, and so they'll in many cases they'll schedule the trips outside of transit agency operating hours. And so so in one example, transit agency, I think this was Nebraska or Pennsylvania, needed to start service at 3 a.m. just to accommodate the dialysis center. Some of the challenges in addition to that, obviously, the wait times can be higher in rural areas, but they try to keep that at a minimum. Also, given the distances that these trips often are required, it requires dedicating a driver, for a full day, and that could be challenging. Taking that vehicle off the fleet and that driver off the fleet, out of operation. And then, we also then talked about some other sort of options for maybe contracting services, but this can be challenging given the trust, particularly with tribal areas was the example, but the trust that occurs when that is built between the driver and the riders, and so, you know, somebody who's not aware, you know, as familiar, just sort of it can make it difficult just to really understand the needs of the riders. And so that's one of the challenges with contracting services. Education outreach was also cut across, you know, probably all these breakout rooms, but it's really key. Pennsylvania offered an example where people are just not aware of the services that were available, so they put together a statewide platform that was there for information for riders, so they could understand what services were available in their community. And it sounds like it's being well received. And similarly, Nebraska is thinking about coordinating across the state for a statewide trip planner. And so there's some interesting work being done there. And that sort of leads to the final point that partnerships and collaboration is really key to all this, and building, you know, both agency partnerships and collaboration with other perhaps nonprofits or local groups on the ground. But that's really important to all this work. So that's our summary. But
Great. Thanks. And Nate.
Hi, everyone. So I led the group on partnerships and coordination, and just it seems like a lot of areas don't have traditional fixed route transit. So it seems like there's a lot of work with taxi companies and volunteer drivers to deliver a lot of services. And often it seems like a big challenge with certain taxi companies is that sometimes the providers have to turn customers away depending on demand, or if there's not enough drivers, or if a ride is even 30 to 45 minutes away. So I think that kind of creates a disconnect between a lot of users and the taxi companies. And so my understanding is that in Wisconsin that they've also developed something called a Find Your Own Driver program, where people can get reimbursed for mileage if they find someone, maybe a family member or friend, who can drive them to certain places, especially if taxis or transit's not always readily available. So it seems like that's often meets a lot of that can be a bridge that for certain partnerships. I also, from my understanding, sometimes a lot of big vendors such as Uber or Lyft are not always provided in these communities, and sometimes the software that these types of providers provide are much better suited towards the layout of urban, more dense environments, and not so much the lower density environments. And so often people have to wait long periods of time after making requests. So I think that's another concern with these types of partnerships, is creating platforms that are context sensitive, especially to rural communities. Yeah, and then I also someone also mentioned a need for better partnerships, particularly between transportation and medical services. And often, you know, in areas with not a lot of medical services, sometimes people have to cross state lines, and that can take 4 or 5 hours of a volunteer driver's day. So maybe better coordination of services, better discovery, and better education and outreach is something that could better enhance these services in the future.
Absolutely. All great. Well, it sounds like there was great discussion in each of the rooms. I enjoyed my room, but I would have liked to be a fly on the wall in the others as well. And I know, Kara, you wanted to have opportunity for general questions as well. I'll put my contact information if anyone's interested in following up. But yeah, thanks to SUMC and RTAP. But Kara, did you want to prompt the remainder?
Well, I do want to thank you, Todd and Michael and Alan, Nate, for leading a very, very important discussion. And I wasn't in any of the breakout rooms, but just hearing about it, it's really brought up so many issues that will move this research forward. We do have 1 or 2 minutes for questions. I don't know if that's really enough time. I don't see any in the chat or Q&A. But if anybody wants to very quickly unmute yourself and ask anything, there's still a minute or 2.
This is Lori from WISDOT. I got cut off in our session, but I was just going to comment that sometimes when you coordinate your funds with like a county and a nonprofit, there are funds that are available only to counties and there are funds that are available only to nonprofits. So maybe combining those funds and doing a coordination together might help some of the resources that they need to get some of these projects going and moving.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Todd?
Oh, I was just gonna say I think I was the idea of getting rid of those funding silos and requirements for using things for only specific purposes with combining those in that way in coordination can certainly be a mechanism to help have greater service capacity opportunity and funding backing. So I think that's a great example. Lori, thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, great. We will be posting the slides and the recording within a week of today. Tomorrow you'll receive a email with a survey. We hope you'll provide feedback and you can respond to that if you have any additional questions. So thank you to our presenters and thank you to our audience. We'll see you at the next webinar. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.